And then in the DRC, all the access specialists have kind of focuses, student populations that we work with. So I work with the students with physical impairments and like mobility impairments, and then also students with health impairments. So I see a lot of students with diagnoses like diabetes, colitis, IBS. So if you had any questions about those kind of questions specifically, or just any of my background, feel free to let me know. And let's get started. Okay, I'm gonna adjust a couple things so I can see all of my slides. Oops. Okay, there we go. Perfect. So I think, like I said, at the beginning of the presentation, I really wanted to focus on just bringing you all some kind of like mindset tools to reframe your like conceptualization of disability and get folks starting to think about disability and accessibility a little bit more. So if this presentation doesn't necessarily feel like kind of a checklist of things to do for your events and your programming, that's kind of purposeful, because I'm wanting to give everybody, again, like a shift in mindset so that you can start to think about your programs from, you know, the perspective of universal design, from the perspective of inclusion, just from the start. So one way to start is to ask questions about the accessibility of your programming, whether that's again, like just departmental meetings, whether that's, you know, just office hours with students, whether that's large programming, small scale programming. Ask questions, but then also bring disabled voices to the table from the start of your planning. So whether that's contacting the DRC to ask just for some tips and tricks, or whether it's going through our website. We have a lot of good just resources posted online, or just doing a little bit of your research on your own to find out what disabled folks are saying is beneficial and helpful and assistive for them, I think is super important. And that just kind of ties into this concept of, you know, if you've met one disabled person, you've met one disabled person. So everybody operates a little bit differently. You know, there's not a one fix for everything that'll make everything, you know, totally inclusive and accessible for everybody. So just realizing that kind of we're constantly having to do our research to educate ourselves, to listen to the voices of those that are, you know, that hold these identities that are the most affected, and to constantly be willing to be flexible and to adjust our programming, that kind of stuff. As I had kind of mentioned, remembering that accessibility and inclusion is not just a checklist. So I think that when we plan events, you know, we're looking for like, okay, as long as the physical space is accessible and I have my, you know, ASL interpreters, like check, we get into this mindset of just like checking boxes of like, if I do all these things, it'll be perfectly accessible. But I would hope to encourage folks more in this realm of universal design and kind of bringing disability justice to the forefront. Again, like we're bringing these disabled voices to the forefront. We're letting disabled folks kind of lead, you know, their concept of what accessibility and inclusion is. We're listening to those voices. We're putting, you know, their kind of asks and demands into place. And then again, like that flexibility piece, realizing that one form of accessibility or one kind of like fix is not just going to work for everybody, but trying our hardest to kind of be flexible and work on a person-by-person basis. So that's just a great place to start in terms of bringing accessibility to your program. A lot of that ties back to this slogan, if any of you have heard of it, nothing about us without us. It stemmed from a disability rights kind of movement in South Africa, but it's basically kind of a slogan to communicate the idea that no policy should be decided by any representative without the full and direct participation of members of the group that are affected by the policy. So you could read policy as event, you know, accessibility, inclusion strategies, that kind of stuff. But you know, if you're hoping to bring accessibility to your programming, if you're hoping to be a little bit more inclusive to folks with disabilities, realizing that they should be a part of that work that you're doing. Initial things to consider, again, when you're looking to make your programs more accessible, asking yourself, how can the body operate? So I like to do kind of just this individual exercise. Well, I will scan my body and I'll consider all my different body parts, and I'll consider all my different, you know, senses and stuff. And I'll consider the spectrum of different ways that all of those different body parts and senses and processes could operate. So I also like to tell people that, you know, disability and symptoms exist on a spectrum. So you could meet one person with a certain diagnosis and their, you know, symptoms could look, they could range, you know, in a range of symptoms, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But that also it affects everybody a little bit differently. So looking at, you know, if you're doing your research on how to make things more accessible and you have found, you know, one tip that might work well for one person, but other. So just opening up your, like, expanding your concept of like what the body is and how it can operate and how everything can impact folks differently. Some initial things also off the bat to consider, just getting down to the nitty gritty of like actual events and programming, is the outreach and marketing. What accessibility information can you include on the forefront? I think it's important to note that folks with disabilities often have to do a lot of forefront planning in order to like get to and participate in events, especially when they're of the, like, you know, in-person nature. We are having to schedule around, you know, needs with care attendance, with transportation needs, and other accessibility needs. So there's a lot more planning that goes into disabled folks participating in things than perhaps non-disabled folks. So I think the more outreach and marketing that you can do on the forefront to, one, get that information out ahead of time so folks with disabilities have adequate time to plan their own lives is super helpful. But then also if you can put accessibility information out there again as early as possible. So is the venue going to be accessible? What kind of accommodations will you have? How can folks request accommodations? Are there interpreters? The more of that you can put on the forefront, the less kind of like planning disabled folks have to do, and it's a great help. So something to just consider at the beginning. And then also large scale, overall, when you're thinking about events and meetings and stuff, being aware of the overall like structure of the schedule and awareness of time. Again, thinking about folks that need just a little bit more time with transportation, either getting to an event or a meeting or getting in between sessions, that kind of stuff. If somebody has to schedule, again, with a personal care attendant or childcare, folks that have different processing needs that might need a little bit more time, in between sessions or in between activities and sessions, or if you're doing some sort of group think thing in a meeting, folks that need just a little bit more time to do that brainstorming. This is something that you can do at the forefront of your planning, is just be a little bit more aware of your time structure for things and allowing for some movement and some flexibility and some grace in there. There's this thing called crip time, if anybody has heard of that. But basically this kind of like, so the disability community is basically reclaiming the term crip or cripple and identifying that way. But crip time kind of refers to this concept that folks with disabilities operate on a different kind of time than non-disabled folks, because it takes so much, longer or whatever to do the planning for getting to things. And then, you can have these unexpected flares of symptoms and getting sick and stuff. So crip time basically just refers to this different mode of time that disabled folks are operating with. So I think the more that we can do to reconceptualize, time structures in our minds and realizing that certain time restrictions don't work for everybody, I think is a great help to making things more accessible. Also looking at web and social media accessibility, I think that's an easy way. There's lots of tools out there to make web content more accessible. A lot of social media platforms will have different accessibility features that are super easy to just go in there and basically turn them on. So those are small ways that you can, from the forefront of your planning and advertising and stuff, make things a little bit more accessible. And then I think it's also important too, depending on the scale and the nature of your event or your meeting, is to build things into your budget. People will often not realize that making things a little bit more accessible does often have a monetary cost to it. So we're paying interpreters, you might be purchasing more signage, that kind of stuff. So just being cognizant of that, because that's something that you'll want to build in from the beginning. Before we dive into some examples of ways that you can make things more accessible, just to leave you with some tangible things, wanting to realize some mindsets that we'll want to dismantle. I think a lot of people, when it comes to accessibility, have some pushback to it. A lot of that speaks to the budget stuff. But these are just some things that we've heard as reasons for why people are resistant to making their space is more accessible. Disabled people don't ever come or haven't ever come to this event, and no one would use it. It's too expensive and it's too difficult. We don't have the resources or staffing to implement this. So I think this speaks to a lot of just underlying ableism within our own minds and our own thought processes. But I think that if we can do our planning from the forefront, accessibility is a lot easier than we think it is. If we can build things into the budget initially, that, gets rid of the concept that things are too expensive or that we don't have the staffing for it. The notion that disabled people don't ever come kind of speaks to, well, if things aren't accessible from the beginning, of course, disabled people won't come because we either, can't get there, we can't participate in the mode of, kind of interaction that's being done. So I think just wanting to avoid these mindsets, realizing that the exclusion of disabled folks is an active choice and not just an oversight. If we kind of pause and do some thinking and really plan, our programming out, we'll notice that we could build these things in a lot easier than we perhaps think. And if we're not making our services accessible to all, then who are they really for? If we're not making them accessible, then they're really for, non-disabled folks. And that's leaving a whole population of our students out, students, faculty, and staff. So kind of hoping that these last couple slides have given you, again, just some ways of reconceptualizing disability in your mind, opening up your understanding of the body and how it can operate, and how accessibility can be brought in from the forefront, and it can really be woven into your planning stages and not just something you implement at the last moment or not just a checklist that you follow. So before I move into some concrete inclusion strategies and accessibility tips, just wanting to note the different types of disabilities that exist. So I think a lot of times when we're talking about accessibility, we tend to think, okay, is the building itself accessible? I think ASL interpreters have become a little bit more common at events, but sometimes we are not moving ourselves out of that just physical accessibility conversation. And I think a lot of that has to do with just unawareness of the different types of disabilities that can exist. They can be visible and they can be invisible. They're not just physical. We have folks with visual and hearing disabilities, but also psychiatric, cognitive and learning, the health impairments, speech and language, brain injuries, chronic pain stuff. Also just wanting to note that disabilities can co-occur. So a lot of the times, and that's statistically pretty common for folks to be dealing with multiple disabilities at a time. And then as I mentioned, symptoms existing on a spectrum. So just wanting to think a little bit more just about the types of disabilities that can exist and how different accommodations could be beneficial for a large group of people. I like this graphic on the right because it goes through permanent, temporary, and situational types of disabilities. So the top row is about touch. And so permanent disability would be perhaps an amputee, doesn't have an arm, and then a temporary disability could be an arm injury, and a situational kind of quote unquote disability would be a new parent, and they show kind of the mom holding the infant in one arm or whatever. So when we're looking at making things more accessible, there's this concept of universal design or inclusive design. And so it basically posits that if you are kind of working on making things more accessible, perhaps just for the disability community, it's actually going to benefit everybody. And so this graphic kind of speaks to that even folks in these situational quote unquote disabilities can benefit from things being more, inclusive when we're looking at folks with perhaps, hearing impairments that need interpreters or that need closed captioning. That can also help people that are just hard of hearing. Translating stuff can help folks that don't, English is not their first language. So we can start to think of the ways in which accessibility really benefits more than just the disability community, which I think is a beautiful thing. So just keeping some of these disabilities in the back of your mind. Again, you can do that activity like scanning your body and thinking about the different ways in which you might operate and the accommodations that you could benefit from, on those varying levels of operating. So some types of accessibility in the next couple slides, just wanting to go through, again, some tangible ways for you all to implement accessibility and inclusion when we're thinking about providing different auditory options. So again, if you can think about your sense of hearing, like what are the different ways and, on a spectrum that it could operate, and things that might assist you. But having interpretation is always great. You can also get interpreters for music as well, which is super cool. Obviously, captioning your videos is really helpful, whether that's auto captioning. There's a lot of softwares in which you can go in and do it afterwards. Assistive listening devices. I believe there's some at Cal Poly for rent through ASI. Providing icons on your signage is helpful for folks with different, speech and language impairments, but again, also for non-native English speaking folks. Providing different reserved seating is great. So folks that need to be a little bit closer for hearing reasons, but that also helps folks that maybe need to sit closer to the exit if they're needing more frequent use of the bathroom. People that want to sit close to the exit, folks with PTSD will often want to have a visual line of sight of the exit of a building just for feelings of safety. So that's great for them as well. Again, so accessibility tips are kind of applying to a broad group of folks and can benefit a lot of people. For visual options, providing enlarged fonts of things and print versions so people can kind of follow along on their own. Audio descriptions of anything that's visually being put out. So I've tried to, in this presentation, whenever there's a graphic up, you want to be visually describing that. There can be audio descriptions put into videos. So if there's videos that you're playing that just have images up or whatever, you'll want to audibly describe those. And then providing electronic formats of things, I think, is super helpful. Folks that use kind of e-readers or any sort of assistive technology that's on their computer, it's great for them to have access to files, hopefully beforehand, but also afterwards, so that they can go through the content kind of on their own with the technology that they need at the pace that they need. The image that's here is just of kind of how assistive listening devices work, in case anyone was interested. Basically just a form of a microphone for those that are hard of hearing. Other types of accessibility, mobility accessibility can look like elevators and ramps and slopes. So making sure that whatever venue you're in is wheelchair accessible. Considering the walking and traveling distances, being again sessions or to your initial meeting, or where is the distance between the parking and the venue that you're at. Is it walkable? One thing we did working for my last job was in commencement, is we put signage out that had the distance basically that it was from the parking lot, whichever parking lot you were at, to the stadium. So folks knew kind of how long of a walk it was going to be. Trying to do also communications ahead of time, just letting people know about kind of, the slopey terrain of Cal Poly's campus, I think is great. So people are prepared for that and they can do their planning. Providing assistive transportation options is also great. Adjustable podiums and mics, again, speaking to the different seating options. And then I think remote participation options is always great. And I think a lot of folks are hoping that kind of this shift in basically work mode that we've had due to Corona will open up some larger conversations about the different ways that folks can participate in things, and hoping that a lot more of just our meetings and our social gatherings and our events and that kind of stuff will become more digitally accessible for folks that either physically get to events or can't get to events and programs at the time in which they were originally, planned, which speaks to, again, the timing of things, considering your overall schedule, like I had said. But then another benefit of having printed materials and handouts is for folks that, have different processing speeds and might want to just follow along on their own time, or go back to things if they've forgotten what was discussed a little bit earlier. Having extended time for activities, just kind of building in some additional buffer time, and that speaks for activities and travel time between sessions or 2 meetings or whatever as well. Allowing for breaks, I think, is great too. Something I've also done back when we were, meeting in person on campus was kind of saying something at the beginning of the meeting of allowing folks to get up and move around. So if folks need to get up, stretch, sitting on the floor is more comfortable, just saying that at the beginning of anything to allow, to give folks that kind of like permission and that okay to move however their body sees fit, I think is a great inclusion strategy. And like I said at the beginning, giving ample notice of things and marketing for event schedules so that folks can have the adequate amount of time that they need to kind of like plan their lives, and any like assistive things that they would need. Looking at bathrooms, something I try to do as well when we're meeting in person is at the beginning of any meeting or session, identify the nearest restroom, so that folks are aware of that. Considering the products and chemicals used in the bathrooms, I know that it's not something we can always control, but another inclusion strategy is to kind of lessen the amounts of chemicals and like fragrances and stuff that we're utilizing just as individuals. That can be aggravating to folks with different health ailments and stuff. So wanting to consider perhaps having like a scent-free event where you just encourage your attendees to wear like as little as possible, basically like heavily scented products, if that makes any sense. Providing gender inclusive restrooms is just great to do overall. Other considerations, providing access to like a quiet space with less stimulation. So that's something we did for commencement as well, because that can be, that's a large scale event that's pretty, loud and lively at times. So providing spaces on campus where folks can go to have less stimulation. So whether that's like lower lights, just less sound, that kind of stuff, that can be great for also, mothers who need to breastfeed and that kind of thing. So you're benefiting a lot more folks than just folks with disabilities with that. Providing trigger warnings for content is great. Being aware of like the lighting that you're using, trigger warnings for the ways that different, flash types of lighting might in fact impact folks. I'd spoken to kind of going scent-free. Utilizing name tags is great, again, for folks with different processing needs or just any impairments with like concentration and memory. It's great to just have that available from the start instead of having folks, feel uncomfortable with needing to constantly ask for reminders of folks' names, and then considering different food options for folks with allergies and other, dietary related impairments, and then easy hydration accessibility. So maybe that's pointing out, where the nearest water fountain is at the beginning, having accessible water at the programming, I think is great to do. So thinking about some of those, just more concrete ways that you can make your programs more accessible or your events. I think it's great for folks to take a look at their own lives. So whether you wanted to do this activity, thinking about just your personal life or perhaps your individual department at Cal Poly or a specific program that you're working on, or a specific class that you're in or that you're teaching. I thought it would be great if folks could brainstorm an inclusion and accessibility barrier that already exists. And then if you wanted to brainstorm a creative workaround to dismantling this barrier, so how can you enhance accessibility? And that could be speaking to anything on the past slides, more like tangible things you can implement. And then what's preventing you from removing this barrier? So thinking back to those mindsets that we want to dismantle at the beginning, what have our like quote unquote excuses been up until this point of, why haven't we made this more inclusive already? And then can we think of any strategic partnerships and collaborations across campus or in our community that could help us get this done? I think, inclusion and accessibility is not just one person's job. It's not just one department's job. It takes all of us to make these large changes on campus. And so I think realizing that we can lean on each other and lean on the resources that already exist in our community and on campus is great too. It doesn't have to just come solely from you. You can work with others. So I don't know. Oh, I can see everybody's videos. I don't know if folks wanted to unmute themselves or just we could take a couple moments and think about this on our own, but then I'd love to hear just from folks across campus, like where do you work and what's been an accessibility barrier that you've noticed, and perhaps some ways in which we could make it a little bit more accessible. So I'll give folks a couple minutes, and then yeah, you can unmute yourself and feel free to chime in, or I'm trying to see if I can see the chat feature. If folks know how to like raise their hands, you could do that as well.
I'll keep an eye on the chat for you, Bailey.
Thanks, Amy. I think it's interesting also to think about, you know, accessibility barriers, especially now that we've moved to so much, you know, digital presence. Have any of those barriers changed for you in your department? Have things gotten a little bit more accessible now that you do have this digital, you know, option of participating in things? How could we continue this awareness of like digital participation into the quote unquote, like, you know, realm of and life after Corona?
It looks like Carrie Mensinger might have a question or something.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hey, Bailey, good to see you.
Hey,
and everyone else. I'm Carrie. I work in university housing. I have an example, I guess, of something we did in university housing around move-in. Move-in's a really hectic time where we're moving in our thousands of residents, and in the past, it was, you know, zones of where people, when they drive in to move their students' belongings, directing them to zones. And I feel like it was just this last year, or maybe it's been happening 2 years now, and it's the move-in committee working with the DRC on adding those symbols you were talking about, the visual cues. And I love the example because it's a good example of inclusive design. It's really helpful for everyone to have on such a hectic day, to have different color symbols, or not just different colors. We used to do color, but that it wasn't very inclusive of folks who have color blindness. So including the actual symbols. So we have like blue square, red heart, so that it's not color dependent only. So I guess that's an example of a barrier that we had in place before. And the creative workaround. And it was just kind of fun. I liked it because then we have fun symbols all over campus.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing, Carrie. I think that's, yeah, super great that you also recognize the aspect of like the color thing too. So that's another way in which the symbols can help, because you're giving a symbol on top of the color. But then that also just helps folks, you know, remember if they could remember a color plus the symbol. That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else have any ideas? I'm curious to hear from anybody that is looking to make just maybe like meetings or more like small scale things more accessible. Are there any thoughts you had on
Actually,
that?
Yeah, Debbie Schwartz put a chat message up. She said that I think that having some of the signs you mentioned available to loan out to different departments on campus would be very, very beneficial.
Great. Yeah, and that's another way that we can all kind of like share the responsibility of accessibility. Is I know there's so many departments on campus who have access to like large quantities of signage that are totally willing to let folks like rent them out. I know, so the commencement office, I think new student transition programs, conference and event planning, those are all departments on campus who have signage. And I think they're pretty generous with renting them out. So if your department can't afford to purchase a bunch of signs, you know, for an event, looking for those campus partners that can lend you things. So ways that we can collectively share, again, the responsibility of accessibility.
Bailey, this is Joe Campbell, and I think extending Carrie's example about move-in, because it's such a physically demanding process. I love the idea about on the signs that we have, giving people the distance, and I would say probably not only the distance, but the elevation right?
Yeah.
It's one thing to move a cart on flat ground, but very different to try and move that thing uphill. So we do provide transportation for folks that need a ride somewhere, but I think giving more information about what the signs could say and distance and elevation might also be really helpful for folks.
Yeah. Those would be nice to just have, yeah, on campus in general, I think.
And there's a message from Jill Victorino in the chat. She says that she works at the International Center and they have a number of activities on Dexter Lawn. Moving forward, they will work with other departments on campus to find ways to make their booths more accessible to people with mobility issues, as simple as moving our booths to the end of the lawn/sidewalk. It's a good one.
That's great. Thank you, Jill, for sharing. Yeah, I think sometimes, you know, accessibility, we think might need to be this complete like overhaul of our programs, or we need to like do all of these strategies to be considered inclusive. But I think there's, yeah, small ways that are super easy that if we could just adjust our thinking a little bit, that, yeah, we could realize that small things could make all the difference and they can be easy. Any other thoughts? What are folks' thoughts on like just the digital participation and kind of the work from home type accommodations that have been offered recently and how those might be good accessibility and inclusion strategies like moving forward? You know, I think a lot about folks with chronic illnesses who maybe are getting sick more frequently and having flares when they're not, you know, can't necessarily like plan, you know, when things are going to happen, that these work from home options can be great, and digital participation. Are these things that like you think that you could easily build into your programming future going forward, digital participation? Collectively, yes.
I mean, I love the idea. I think we've proven that we can do this. I think there's some HR stuff that's like maybe I don't want to call it a barrier, but a challenge. But I've read a lot of good works that show, you know, the fact that we were able to go virtual and have so many folks telecommuting is kind of proof that we've been able to do this, especially for folks with disabilities, for a long time, but maybe we just didn't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Well, thanks for addressing that, Carrie. I think when we're talking about barriers, you know, they don't just exist physically, but they can also exist, you know, attitudinally and socially. So what have our kind of attitudes and our prejudices towards disability been in the past and even currently now that have prevented, you know, this from being more of a mainstream option for folks? Attitudinal barriers exist that prevent this from being an option going forward? You know, you kind of had spoke about HR concerns. And I think with the, you know, working remotely and digital participation, there's this concern of like, oh, are folks actually working or actually participating because we're not there in person? Those are definitely attitudinal, you know, barriers that exist to making things more accessible. And it almost feels to me like a form of, you know, disability kind of like gatekeeping. Like, are you disabled enough for this to be, you know, an option for you to actually need? So I think that's great. Yeah, looking at the barriers to making our programs and our meetings and things more accessible, that doesn't just have to be, you know, physical, looking at the ways that events exist, you know, on campus with the terrain and using signage. We can think about attitudinal barriers as well. Anybody else have other examples or of things that they've seen around campus in general? And we might also think about just the way that higher education in and of itself is like a little inaccessible.
Carrie just added that she likes the way you said it, that sometimes our barriers are attitudinal or social. Thanks, Carrie.
Does anybody have any thoughts on like the way that the new online format for classes and stuff this quarter and summer quarter might pose barriers to students? Or it might be helpful to certain students to have this as an option?
I think there might be some students that don't have reliable internet connections where they are. So I think that, I don't know if financial accessibility is a way to look at that, but people who don't have resources, and especially during the pandemic, you know, you can't go to Starbucks and sit there anymore and use, you know, things that are accessible publicly. So I think that's something that I've heard from students, that it can be really difficult if you don't have reliable Wi-Fi at home.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Joe. I'm interested in that idea of like communal access to things. And now that we are less communal, you know, folks are having to rely on themselves and their individual resources to kind of make things work. And so that kind of speaks to this last question of like, how can we work in collaboration? Those opportunities for collaboration might feel lessened now that we're not, you know, in person together, you know, working on things. So that's something interesting to consider moving forward. But yeah, financial accessibility, we can definitely look at all forms of accessibility. And I think that, you know, they're all interlinked. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I'm interested to hear, yeah, just from different departments. Oops. Are there any strategies that folks are interested in implementing, but they're not quite sure like how to start, or kind of how to begin? Were there any strategies mentioned that you were like, oh yeah, that one could specifically, you know, work for us, or that seems doable? I can go back to a couple of them. So just looking through these, were there any that seemed easy? Or if folks have any thoughts of like, oh, why haven't, you know, we done these things in the past? Has it mostly just been like attitudinal, like not aware of things, or? I think
Hey,
providing,
Bailey.
yeah.
Hey, I just have one. Sometimes when we're setting up rooms for, it could be students or just campus partners to come and attend something, we space chairs out. So if people just want a little bit more distancing, not just because of COVID, but just want a little more space, or maybe are uncomfortable being in a corner or would prefer to be in a corner, or maybe would prefer not to have their back to a doorway, prefer to see a doorway, things like that. So just to think about seating arrangements and to make options available.
Definitely. That's awesome. Thank you for whoever shared that in the chat. Definitely an easy way to just like, yeah, consider the configuration of the space that you're meeting in and how that's conducive to some folks or not. I was going to say, I think providing different formats of things. So, you know, always sending out your slides afterwards, any materials that you pass out, handing those out digitally. I think that's a great kind of like easy way to increase accessibility. I think having print versions for folks when we're meeting in person, I think is great.
Oh, I just got a message from Debbie Schwartz. So she posted, I am a volunteer usher at the Performing Arts Center and just went through an online training for sensory inclusion. I am pleased that they are moving forward with this and was happy to learn even more things from this presentation today. Nice. Thanks, Debbie.
That's great. Thanks for sharing, Debbie. What kind of like inclusion strategies did they talk about in that training, if you wanted to share, or how do they like specifically apply to the PAC too, would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, so they, it was quite a while ago. I don't remember all of the exact things. And since we had to do it online, I think once we were able to get back together again, it'll be a little bit more in depth and a little bit more training. But it just basically talked about some of the things that you mentioned as far as having a quiet room for folks that need to, escape from the noise of the production. Having a room where families can come if they need to go as a family to just kind of regather their thoughts and take some time away from all the hustle and bustle. One of the other things that stands out in my mind is that, a lot of folks don't like to be touched, or some of them have difficulty with eye contact, and kind of just made us aware of those are some of the disabilities that maybe some of our patrons might have when they come in. So it's kind of at this stage, I think, more of an awareness for us, but I think that, like I said, there'll be some more in-depth training as we get back together again.
Great, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I love the idea of having a quiet, like sensory space. I think that's something great. I think that's something that could be easily implemented, campus-wide, having a kind of long-standing space or consistently available space for students and faculty and staff. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything they want to chime in? Other strategies that they've heard of, concerns that they have noticed in their own areas within accessibility? Go to this last slide. So just wanted to provide, and I'll send out I can send out the slides for this presentation as well, but just wanting to provide some resources that exist already. So we've got an event planning guide on the DRC's website that has a lot of great information that speaks to a lot of how to go about implementing some of these accessibility tips. We've got information on inclusive design. You might also know it as universal design on our website. There's a couple links to guides to, just creating accessible events that are more kind of checklisty if you're interested in, again, just having those tangible examples of ways. I like this link about disability language stuff that exists there, the third from the bottom. I think that's something we didn't really talk about today, but language inclusivity and language inclusion, how are we being inclusive in our language of folks with disabilities? So whether that's like, ridding our language of certain words, crazy, insane, the R slur, that can be a form of inclusion and accessibility as well. If anyone was interested in learning more about going, fragrance and scent free, that's a great resource there from UCLA. And then I also liked some lighting, if you were needing examples of signage, and we talked a lot about signage and kind of icons today. That last link on there is some examples of things you might put up to warn folks about different types of lighting that are being used in events. See, is there anything more in the group chat? It's not going off.
Haley, this is John. I just posted a link that more specific to what we're dealing with now with COVID on virtual meetings and events accessible to the disability community. So there's probably going to be a lot of overlap with what you covered, but the link I put there is specific to things like this. When you're doing Zoom meetings or anything like that, where it's virtual participation. So check that out.
Thank you, John. Let's see. And then also included some local resources here at the end if you're interested in learning more and partnering. I want to, give John Lee a shout out. So he's one of the participants in this presentation, but he's our technology specialist down at the DRC. So he's been doing a lot of great work with CTLT and just the academic side of campus, getting all of the digital content, for students and stuff, making sure that that's accessible. He does a great job providing information on web and social media accessibility to folks. So we have a lot of information already on our DRC website. I would encourage folks to go through and read, but then also, feel free to reach out to John with any questions. And, myself and any of the other DRC staff, if you're interested in collaborating and working more closely on future events and programs. I think that is, let me find a way to.
Yeah, and Jill just did a shout out in the chat that she will include the planning guides to their event proposal packets, and she thanks you for the resources.
Oh, great. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I'll find a way to get these slides to y'all so you can access some of those hyperlinked things and do a little bit more learning. Encourage you all to, just save this information in your back pocket for back when we're, planning more in-person things, and just be continuing to do your own research and education. The DRC staff is always available, again, like I said, to kind of do consultative work, to meet with you in group meetings and kind of provide, a walkthrough of your events and your meetings, or even just your centers specifically, and brainstorm together some ways that we can make things a little bit more inclusive. Thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, I'll stick around on the video, and if not, I will see you all in the digital sphere, or again when we're back in person. Thank you, everyone.
If you can just hang for a little bit, Bailey, I'm going to hang with you and I'll just watch the chat. Everybody think that